Okay, welcome to our event this evening here at the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. We're absolutely delighted that you're able to join us here with Andrew Mitchell this evening. My name is Sarah Steele and I'm Deputy Director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. We're absolutely delighted to have those of you who've managed to join us in person. It feels like I've seen a lot of things on screens for the last year, but some of you are joining us online and we'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. Of course, many of us have weathered different kind of circumstances. Some of us can't join in the room. And in many respects, the college too has weathered many things over the years. Of course, it originated as a 12th century nunnery, and it's been a college since 1496. We've been through all manner of things, civil world wars, and various different pandemics in the past. So more recently, the Intellectual Forum was set up to kind of give us an opportunity to talk about these topical things, to talk about what was going on in the world, to talk about what we should expect for the future, and to research outside the boundaries of our disciplines that many of us in colleges find ourselves in, and to really talk about the important issues of today and the future. We've had so many speakers. I think as an Australian, I've had two former prime ministers come here and visit, Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, fortunately not at the same time if you know anything about Australian politics. We've also had Director of NASA's Chanda X-ray Observatory, Belinda Wilkes. We've had various people like Peter Singer from the World Health Organization. All of these events are somewhere recorded online. You can dig around the college's YouTube and enjoy them. And we'd really encourage you to have a look at many of the things we've offered in the past. And one of the things that sits there is also some brilliant work by our own academics here in the college. We've got an excellent lecture there from you, James, up there in the corner. And we've got many different things on the Jesus College YouTube channel that you can enjoy. Things on how synthetic biology can come up with new, safer ways to dye textiles, how we could fix the financial system to attend to climate change, all of these kind of things. But our speaker tonight is actually one of our own. Andrew, you were an undergraduate student here at Jesus, and you studied history. You've obviously had a close association with the college since. Many faces around the room know you and you've seen them. And you're currently a visiting fellow here at the college. So we're so glad to have you here. Obviously, you're a Conservative and you were first elected to Parliament in 1987. And amongst many offices, you've served as Secretary of State for International Development, as the Chief Whip. And I'm sure we'll find out many more other things that you've done and all the things you've thought about and the experiences you've had throughout this evening. There's lots of opportunities to talk about that, but obviously it's also in your book. So you've obviously recently published what I'm told, unfortunately, I've not yet got to read it because it was sold out on Amazon for quite some time, but I'm told you're very, very frank about your experiences in the book, and there's some very amusing ones there. And that I'm also told reliably that the bookstores of Cambridge have now obtained copies and they are available. So you can all run out if you haven't already read it and buy the book yourself. But we'll start this evening by having a chat, and then we'll take questions from you in the audience, both here in the room and also online. So if you're online, feel free to put your questions in the chat and they will come through to us and we'll be able to take some of them and pass them along to you this evening. So Andrew, welcome and thank you for being with us. I'm sure there's many questions about contemporary topics that you've brought, but I would want to start kind of at the beginning. Obviously, your father was a Conservative MP himself. How was that? How do you think that's influenced you? And my big question is, did you have any choice about your party or your career?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And first of all, welcome to everybody who's very kindly turned up tonight and to those who are watching us online. And thank you so much, Sarah, for stepping in, because I know that Julian was going to be doing this, but unfortunately succumbed to COVID this morning, and you have very generously agreed to take over his slot. So I think we should give Sarah a big round of applause, actually, for doing it. Which is very good of her. Julian, of course, was a colleague in the House of Commons. He was a Liberal Democrat member of Parliament, but he and I worked together on a number of things. And one of the things I try to do in the book is explain that what the public see about politicians is very adversarial, but actually there's an enormous amount that goes on, which is very much part of the cooperation across the House. And I hope that comes out, particularly in the last chapter of the book. Now, you started at the beginning of when I grew up in a political household. And I think the one great advantage of growing up in a household where your dad is a member of Parliament, and of course this would be true if your dad or mum were a vicar or a teacher or a doctor, but you have the opportunity to discover at one remove the stresses and strains, the pluses and minuses of a job, a role. And I certainly heard that. I hope I grew up understanding that the role of a politician and a member of Parliament is not to strut their stuff on television or at Westminster primarily. It is to represent the 100,000 people in each constituency who send him or her down to Westminster. And I think, I like to think that I got an understanding of the concept of service, which is at the heart of politics, from having a father in the House of Commons. And we served together for 10 years in the House of Commons, actually. We sort of treated each other like colleagues rather than father and son. He used to refer to me as his honorable and filial friend when, and I had ministerial responsibility for a benighted organization called the Child Support Agency, which was voted for unanimously by the House of Commons. And it was a way of basically trying to stop principally fathers evading their duty to look after and pay for their children. But of course, like any of these things which are universally agreed, when they're set up, things start to go wrong. And of course, an agency like that is dipping its fingers into the private lives of people, although it tells everybody it's only about money, it's only about your financial liabilities. And so the result of that was enormous numbers of members of Parliament were very cross with the minister at the inadequacies of this agency because it took on far more than it could bite. And one of them was my dad. So I used to get attacked, much to the amusement of the House of Commons, by my father, sort of saying, what is my honourable and filial friend doing about this agency? So we served together in the House of Commons for 10 years. Not many people have done that. I mean, I think if you go back, Harold Millen was in the House with his son. Lloyd George was in the House with his son, but there are not very many. There's very few, and certainly not many who did 10 years. So that was an interesting feature of my early years in the House of Commons. But I wrote this book during lockdown. I shall never write another book. I was asked at the launch whether I'd write another book, and I said, partly in jest, that I had considered writing a steamy Westminster bonkbuster, not least in order to become the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. But my wife had said that if I did it, she'd have to rewrite all the sex scenes, so I wasn't going to do it after all. So I'm not intending to write another book. This book comes in many parts. I'm trying to amuse. Simon Heffer, who reviewed it for the New Statesman, very generously said it was like an enjoyable after-dinner speech that goes on for quite a long time. But I'm trying to entertain. But I'm also trying to describe an establishment in Britain which has changed out of all recognition over the last years. And it's changed. I mean, I've been part of so many different parts of it. I was at a British prep school, rugby, then the army, then Cambridge, then the city, then Parliament, then the cabinet. And all these organizations have changed out of all recognition, really, over the 40 or 50 years that I'm covering in the book. Some of them for the better. The one that is least changed, I think, is the military, although that's much smaller than it was, and their tasks have changed quite a lot. But I'm trying to talk about those changes to the establishment and also to talk about the way politics particularly has changed. Because when I first joined the House of Commons in 1987, Mrs. Thatcher was in her pomp. And she was a sort of goddess, really. I mean, she was terrifying. I used to stand, when she would rush by with her entourage in the corridors of the House of Commons, I would stand to attention and look straight ahead and hope to goodness that she would pass on by without fixing me with her beady eye and asking me what I thought of the money supply figures published that morning or something like that. And in the tea room too, she would come into the tea room a lot in the House of Commons, and very different from her successors, or most of her successors. And she would sit down with her famous handbag, which had a note on almost everything secreted within it. And she'd fix someone with a beady eye and ask them what they thought about some detailed economic prognostication that had been published that morning. And their answers would quite often be found wanting. And Mrs. Thatcher was adored and hated. You know, in the House of Commons, in the parliamentary party, there were people who absolutely adored her in a way I haven't seen in any other leader of a party since, and also people who disliked her intensely and held her to account for, as they perceived it, the bad things that she'd done, and as others who adored her perceived it, the very good things that she had done. No other prime minister comes anywhere near that degree of love and hatred, and it's why the Tory party has been so convulsed, particularly over Europe, because of the way she was defenestrated back in 1990. And I described aspects of that because I had a front seat view of what was happening, because I was the parliamentary private secretary to John Wakem, who was my cabinet boss, and who sort of managed her exit from the House of Commons, or from the premiership, because there's only two ways in which a prime minister can be removed, and it's apposite at the moment. One is through a vote in the House of Commons to remove them, and that is not going to happen. Wasn't going to happen under Mrs. Thatcher, and won't happen now. And the other way is if they lose the confidence of their colleagues, and particularly their cabinet colleagues. And that was the other way, and that was the way that Mrs. Thatcher was managed out principally by John Wakem. So my book is really trying to describe the changes in all these establishment organizations. It's trying to entertain. There's a chapter on Cambridge and on the college here, which I hope is written with the deepest possible affection, Master. It's very kind of you to come along tonight, and James. It also talks about development, about which I am passionate, and I sort of dabble in academia. I'm enormously honored to be a visiting fellow here. I'm an honorary professor at Birmingham University, which is my local university for my constituency of the Royal Town of Sutton Coldfields, and I'm a visiting professor a visiting fellow when it's possible in Harvard. But it's always about international development, and that is the thing that I have done for 15 years and more. And I had the great good fortune that I was given the task of being the shadow Minister for International Development, first of all by Michael Howard and then by David Cameron. And so I was able literally to go and sit at the feet around the world of the real experts on development and try and bring about a center-right policy for international development. And we were very respectful, or I was very respectful of what Labour had done. And I used to refer to it as a British policy rather than a party political one. And what we really wanted to do was to build the next floors on the house that Labour had erected, particularly when they set up DFID, but also after the Gleneagles summit, the oomph that Britain put into trying to lead on soft power and international development. And there's two chapters in there on that, which I really care about, but I'm not trying to preach. I'm trying to tell a story, because the interesting thing about international development is that about 50% of people in the country support it and 50% don't. And those of us who are passionate about it have to accept that we haven't made what we think is an absolutely compelling case that our fellow citizens accept. And that's one of the issues, particularly at the moment. But I'm not trying to preach in the chapters. I'm trying to tell a story about why it matters and why Britain has the power, or had the power, to do so much about these appalling discrepancies of wealth and opportunity, which so disfigure our world.
So I have a question about that. We had Stephen Twigg here in 2019, I believe. And at that time, it was said that the 0.7% international development aid was firmly agreed across parties. It wasn't at risk. And the government has quite obviously scrapped that. And you spoke out pretty strongly against it. So what do you think about that decision in light of what you've said about your dedication to development here, international development?
Well, I think it's appalling, and I've made it very clear in the House of Commons. And I led the revolt against it by Tory members of Parliament because we thought it was quite wrong to break a promise. I think it was Archbishop Desmond Tutu who said that a promise to the poorest people in the world is a sacred thing. And I thought it was dreadful to break that promise made on the floor of the United Nations, where Britain is one of the 5 permanent members, and also enshrined in law. And there was a lot of backwards and forwards about whether it was the law technically bit on the point, but it seemed to me if it didn't legally bite, it certainly morally did. And, you know, we very nearly stopped the government from doing it because through a bit of careful footwork, we tabled an amendment on a Thursday at 4:29 to a bill which we were told could be amended. And we tabled this amendment. We put 15 names on it. On the second day, we put 15 more names on it, including Theresa May's. We had former cabinet ministers, a lot of privy councillors. And the reason I tabled it at 4:29 was because had I still been chief whip and I'd had time, I would have known how to override our amendment. So I tabled it 1 minute before closing time, so the government couldn't amend it. And the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer spent most of the weekend ringing round trying to get people not to support it. But had it been called by the Speaker on the Monday following, we would have won. And we'd have won by about 17 votes. As it was, once the Speaker declined to call the amendment, the government knew that they had time to burn off people. And in the end, 26 colleagues voted for the amendment, but you need 43 in this Parliament to win, and the others were burnt off. So we didn't get it through. But it was I think those 26 will in future be quite proud of that vote. No one likes voting against their own party. But I think that that was a good vote upon which to vote against your party.
And within the party, one of the things that I've noted is that you've had this scheme you set up for Conservatives to work in Rwanda as volunteers. Could you set out a little bit more about this? You reflected in what you said that you'd kind of become interested in the area of international development and kind of educated yourself in it, and then got involved and encouraged your colleagues to volunteer and work in different ways. Could you reflect on that a little bit and tell us a little bit more about it?
Well, I set up the project Mubano, which means cooperation and friendship, not people with money telling people without money what to do. It was about partnership, which is at the heart of international development. And I did it really for 3 reasons. The first was I thought it would do a tiny bit of good in Rwanda. And we did it in Rwanda and Sierra Leone as a sort of backup country. But if you think about it from the Conservative Party's point of view, you needed to be somewhere that was pretty safe, that was relatively small, and was at a certain stage of its development. And so we did it in Rwanda, firstly, to do a tiny bit of good in a country that has suffered terribly in the genocide and suffered from the deep excesses of poverty and misery and conflict. The second reason I did it was to give all of us a life-changing experience. Certainly changed my life, teaching English there for many years, for 2 weeks, with 60 Rwandan teachers of English, aged from about 20 to 60. And you get to know people quite well in that sort of circumstances. But the third reason I did it was to try and this is a huge failure, is to try and embed within the Tory party strong DNA about the importance of development, because there would be a core of people there who had been to a poor country and had seen what works and what doesn't work right up at the coalface, at the sharp end. And so that was my plan. And in fact, there are more alumni, if you like, of Project Mubano in the House of Commons than there are Liberal Democrats and SNP members combined. So, you know, it's the third biggest party in the House of Commons, the Mubanoites, really. And it certainly did mean that when we were arguing for the 0.7 in opposition and then introducing it in government, because although it has now been reined back to 0.5 in breach of the promise, it was a Conservative-led government that introduced it. We did have a lot of people who understood why it was so important and were very committed to it. And the way in politics, I describe it a bit in the book, is that the tug of party loyalty is quite strong. It can be the tug because you want a job. It's a tug because you want an honor. It can be an honest tug of people who want to be loyal to their party, want to support their party. But for whatever reason, the strength of that has dissipated and it hasn't worked. But it still undoubtedly did a little bit of good, and it undoubtedly changed the lives of quite a lot of people who went on it. And with a bit of luck, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is at pains to tell me that he's going to restore it to 0.7 in 24-25, and I take him at his word.
So in your book, you have a chapter about your roles in various different things, but including in Boris's election as PM. What do you think about his performance now?
Well, I put Boris Johnson on the candidates list back in 1992 when I had this extraordinary job of vice chairman of the party responsible for candidates. And that job was to decide whether someone who wanted to be a member of parliament, wanted to be a MEP, a Conservative candidate, hit the bar, the appropriate bar. And it was about, you know, their integrity, their knowledge, their passion and support for the Conservative cause. So it wasn't, my job was not to sort out who should be the next Prime Minister. It was to sort out whether someone met the bar to be a candidate. And the Tory party had 600 candidates about at any one time on the list. And after an election, some people would decide not to continue or would not continue, and other new people would come on. And Boris came to a selection weekend down near Heathrow, which is where we always used to hold them. And he was an enormously divisive figure because he'd been reporting from Brussels for the Telegraph and writing stories which were made up, I mean, I think, and annoyed John Major, the Prime Minister, beyond endurance, as he wrote about how the British were supporting the EU and wanting to straighten out bananas and so forth, which is completely untrue. But he wrote these stories which electrified the Telegraph readership. And the MEPs were very much against him joining the list. And I said, you know, whatever you think about him, he's a Tory and he does meet the bar. And that was the controversy. And then he got on the list, and I knew him pretty well. And I knew him when he was mayor and when he was in Parliament first at Henley. And I write about some of the amusing incidents. But when he became leader of the party, I was wary because he had told me that he didn't much care for DFID. And so there was a meeting in my office where I said to him, Boris, I want to support you. I think you are a very interesting prospective leader of the party. And the main reason I want to support you is because I think that the party and the country have to be led by a Brexiteer now. And if you think about it, in 2016, when Theresa May was elected, between 2016 and 2019, when she left, the country and the party was having a near nervous breakdown about Brexit and what was to happen. I mean, Cambridge is one of the towns where the vote against Brexit was the strongest. My constituency was 50-50. I was against Brexit. But I learned under the way poor Theresa May was sort of tossed on the horns of all of this, that the country really needed a Brexiteer to get us through this nervous breakdown over Brexit. And that was I mean, whether you agree or not, that was my logic of thinking that Boris was the right person to lead. And I'd supported him very strongly in 2016 and was very cross with him for pulling out of the contest. And if you think about it, it might have been better for the country and the Tory party if Boris had led in 2016 over Brexit, and then we'd had Theresa May. And so we sat in my office and he said, I want you to support me. And I said, I can only support you if you look me in the eye and you promise me you won't get rid of DFID and you won't tamper with the 0.7. And he looked me in the eye and he said, Andrew, DFID is safe. So you can imagine I was rather disillusioned and upset when he vaporized DFID, and he vaporized DFID without anyone being told. I mean, it was kept extremely tight amongst very, very few politicians, and even the department didn't know until the day, really. So I have been extremely cross with him about that. He also said that he would bring me back into his cabinet because he needed my knowledge on various things. And he told my constituents that at a meeting which he came to, about 400 of them attended to support him. So I'm much less concerned about that than I am about what he did to DFID and the 0.7. But it is one of the reasons why Boris's relationship and mine is not quite as good as it was in the past. Probably wasn't helped by me telling him in the House of Commons on Monday a week ago that I thought he should go.
With that in mind, you're a former chief whip. You've seen how the business is done. You've seen these kind of difficult things, and you've seen, in effect, how the sausage is made, how the party manages different people. And would you say that party management is competent right now?
So sausage is being made, which I can hear Julian's voice saying that, because with Julian's understanding of these things, particularly, I mean, it is said that anyone who has watched sausages being made would never eat them. And the whip's office is a bit like that. You know, Enoch Powell once said that cities need sewers in the same way that governments need whip's offices. And you know, whipping is essential. It's to ensure that the government gets its business. Everyone accepts that the government gets its business, and the opposition have a right to delay it. Actually, something that has been eroded by both parties in government through the use of the guillotine, the timetable. So business, you know, goes through automatically at the end of the time, not when it's been fully debated. But the government has a right to get its business, and the job of the government whip's office is to make sure that they do. And I explain in the book that, you know, whips are not immoral or moral, they are amoral. So that if the government decides, the cabinet decides that they want to bring forward the slaughter of the firstborn bill, then the Prime Minister will ask the Chief Whip whether he can get it through the Commons or she can get it through the Commons. And there's only three answers. One is yes, one is no, and the other is give me 24 hours and I will find out. And you whips then talk to their flocks about that. And it's then the job of the whip to explain, you know, that in your constituency there's an enormous number of firstborn children who are fettering the chances of the second and thirdborn, and there are more second and thirdborn children in your constituency than first. So you're going to get a larger majority by supporting this bill. That is the job of the whip. It is to get the government's business through. And I can talk about whipping in a way that no other former chief whip has done, because whipping has changed so much. You know, I write about it over Maastricht, when the government whip's office, of which I was very proud to be a part, did a brilliant job keeping John Major afloat and got the Maastricht Treaty through. Although there were people in the office who didn't believe in the Maastricht Treaty, we got it through. And night after night, we would have votes at 3 o'clock in the morning and win it by 2, or 2 o'clock in the morning and win it by 3. And, you know, it was a very complex business. And we could do things which you could never do today. I mean, I tell the story in the book about seeing one of my colleagues literally lifted off the ground by his neck, by his tie and collar, by a big, thick-set, heavyweight whip when he was threatening to vote against the government. And I also tell a story that actually belongs more properly to Jack Straw, who was being put up against a wall by the deputy chief whip in the Labour Party, Walter Harrison, who was arguing with him about whether he would vote against government, and suddenly felt, I think the polite way of saying it is, a searing pain between his legs as he was sort of kneed in the groin by the whip. Now, none of that today. You'd go to prison for doing something like that today if you did it. And social media means too that if the chief whip calls you a very rude word, which the chief whip does quite often to colleagues on both sides of the house, in the old days it was, you know, it's what happened, but now it would be put on social media and it would go whizzing round. So whipping has completely changed, and for that reason I feel that I can write about it in a more open way to tell some I hope, quite funny stories about what happened, but without identifying names of people who wouldn't want to be identified, because it's not my purpose to upset people in the book, rather unlike the diaries of my friend and colleague Alan Duncan, which was designed specifically to upset and offend people. I'm not trying to do that in the book. I'm trying to entertain and amuse and tell a story. And I can talk about whipping in a way that others have not done because of that enormous change.
In the book, you have pictures with you, Jeremy Corbyn, for example. He's rather obviously demonized as a character in many respects amongst the press and amongst the right, frankly. And indeed, some, I would say, on the left. Yeah. How did you find working with him? And what does that say, do you think, about cross-party cooperation?
Well, I knew Jeremy quite well because I was the chairman of the Conservatives in Islington when he was first an MP for Islington. And the Conservatives in Islington were a small and dedicated bunch with the emphasis on small. And he was there, and he's the MP on my wife, who's a doctor's patch, and they tend to talk to each other about particular cases which he may send to her or she may send to him. And they both speak extremely highly of each other. So I sort of knew Jeremy a bit through those two things. But I really got to know him. The piece that's in the book is about the Guantanamo Bay all-party group, which was run by John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor. And he ran it, and Jeremy Corbyn and I were the vice chairs, and David Davis was the secretary. So it's a pretty odd group of people, really. It was very cross-party. And at the meetings of the all-party group, there used to be a lot of people who were very much on the left, and they used to look at me and David Davis when they saw us in the meeting, slightly askance. And John McDonnell would say, these two are okay on this issue, at least they're okay. And what we wanted to do was to get Shaka Armour out of Guantanamo Bay. Now, Shaka Armour was the last British prisoner held in Guantanamo Bay. He was hoovered up in the aftermath of the taking by the Americans of Kabul, when they put a bounty on people's heads, and he was delivered so that the people who hoovered him up and took him to the Americans got paid $5,000 or whatever it was at the time. And he was incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay for 13 years without any due process. And we thought that was wrong. And indeed, David Cameron had asked Obama on 3 separate occasions to release him. And Obama had said that he would. But remember, Obama said on his first day in office that he would close Guantanamo Bay. And 8 years later, it was still open. And it's because of the checks and balances in America, which we don't have in this country, that his wish was thwarted. But Cameron had asked him 2 or 3 times, and he said he would try to do it, and he couldn't, and wasn't able to do so. And so the APPG decided to send the 4 of us on the back of a motion unanimously agreed by the House of Commons across to America to try and see if we could get him out. And the visit was enormously amusing. I mean, first of all, David Davis and I flew at the back of the aeroplane. John wasn't well, so Andy Slaughter, who's a very clever left-wing Labour MP in London, he replaced John. He travelled club, and there was no sign of Jeremy Corbyn. We got to the hotel where David and I were put in very nice rooms. Andy Slaughter got a suite, and then Jeremy was put in the honeymoon suite at the top of the hotel. So there was clearly a sort of pecking order with Reprieve, who were the secretariat for the all-party group. And we then had an extremely difficult meeting with the Guantanamo envoy, where there were about 8 officials from defense and about 4 officials from state. And we said, it's intolerable you treat your ally like this, and you keep this guy locked up. If he's done something wrong, you put him on trial. He's never seen his 13-year-old son. Anyway, we had a hammer and tongs, and then that night we went out for dinner, and David and I remember saying to Jeremy, are you going to run for leader of the Labour Party? Because this was after the 2015 election when Ed Miliband had resigned. And Jeremy said, no, it's John's turn, because the left always caucus and they agree to put up a candidate who doesn't normally get on the ballot paper. Anyway, then we had this wonderful dinner. Jeremy doesn't drink, but he's an expert on cheese. So the rest of us drank, and he chose the cheese. And they then had this meeting, and John was unwell. Diane Abbott said she wouldn't do it. So Jeremy said, well, I suppose I better do it. Without any huge expectation of getting on the ballot paper. Then, as history records, he got on the ballot paper because at the last moment, a very right-wing Labour MP, Margaret Beckett, signed his nomination to get him over the hill. And the rest is history. But on that night, he said he wouldn't. Anyway, we came back to Britain convinced we hadn't moved the dial. And 6 weeks later, the Americans let him out. And he was flown back here. And I think mainly because they didn't want another visit from Messrs. Corbyn, Mitchell, Davis, and Slaughter. But he came back, and he came to the House of Commons, and we saw him, and he thanked us all. And there's slight nervousness that we might have got it wrong. He'd never been put through due process. He'd never even seen his 13-year-old son. But the only thing Shaka has said since he came back in 2015, the only thing he has said is, if you want to harm or do harm in Britain, you should get the hell out. That's all he said. He's been sorting out his family life and so on. So we were right. And to this day, I think Guantanamo is an enormous scar on the reputation and responsibility of the American state.
So you've clearly reflected on a number of difficult aspects as well as things that you've had to work on. Obviously, you've had some interactions with the police over the years. And you may have seen, I know when we were coming in, that Cressida Dick seems to actually have just resigned as Met Police Commissioner. What's your perspective on her tenure and on the future?
Well, I'm not really the right person to talk about the police because I had a spot of bother, which none of you will remember, some 9 years ago. And a police officer went to prison first, trying to stitch me up from the unit, but I lost my libel case. So it all ended in a terrible and extraordinarily expensive mess. But the thing about the police is there are two things about the police which I think are important. And with Cressida Dick, who I think has been quite a good chief of police, actually, in many ways. There's two key things I would say about the police. And running the Met is different from any other force. I know quite a lot about the Met for reasons which I wish I didn't, but I do know quite a lot about them. And of course, 80–90% of police officers do a great job for their local community and are very, very good in what they do. But the problem of leading the Met, I think, is enormous. Leading this organization, huge numbers of people on the front line. And my view is that it would be better if the Met was led, as it was before the war, by a senior military officer or by an outsider, not by a police officer. I think it needs to have that degree of detachment and objectivity to lead a massive organization like the Met. And the other thing I would say, and I think this is borne out irrefutably by ghastly recent events, is that the culture of the Met, very, very deeply ingrained indeed, is that they look after their own. They believe it is not in the interest of policing to wash their dirty linen in public, and they close around. And you see it with whistleblowers. If you're a whistleblower in the police, your life is literally destroyed. And so they don't have many whistleblowers, and decent police who want to blow the whistle are not able to do so. And what that means to me is the importance of answering the question of who polices the police. Because, the IPCC, as it was, I think it's now the IOPC, a lot of the people who work in there are former coppers. So they're part of this culture, no matter how honorable they are part of this culture. And I think that the job of Parliament is probably to beef up very significantly the way in which we police the police so that they are more accountable. But those are the two things that I think probably matter most.
So we've reflected a little bit on the future in that response. What do you think's next for British politics? And perhaps more importantly, the future of our democracy, rule of law? Any big reflections?
Well, Brexit is the issue that has driven politics off course. And I mean, it's a fact now, and it's happened, but it's put people against each other. It's put some people within families against each other. And it is an enormous upheaval. And I don't myself expect ever to vote for a referendum on anything again. We live in a parliamentary democracy where if you elect a member of parliament to use their judgment, And if you don't like the way they exercise their judgment, you get rid of them at the next election. That at least is the constitutional theory. So I think that I've now been inoculated against referenda anyway. I mean, British politics is going through a stage, as American politics has, where populism has risen very high indeed. And, you know, Trump and Boris Johnson, I think, I would argue, they have characteristics in common. And for me, I don't think that that is the best way in which society is led. I think Boris is a completely different prime minister to any other prime minister in my time. I mean, being a prime minister requires quite extraordinary attention to detail, energy, vigor, working all the hours that God gives to carry out that job. If you think back to the way in which Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, to name but a few, have the rigor which they have brought to that job. Boris, it's much more showtime. And that's been very attractive to people. And be in no doubt, I used to canvass in the last election in the red wall seats in the West Midlands. And I used to say to people, are you going to vote Conservative? And they'd say, no, I'm going to vote for Boris. And he is a phenomenon, and with extraordinary talent. But it feels, I've said this on the radio, so I'm not saying anything that is particularly new, but I think he governs as if he's running a medieval court. He doesn't use the sinews of government, the cabinet, the Whitehall, the National Security Council, a brilliant innovation of government which ties together all Britain's international facing assets and issues. He doesn't do that. He runs it like a king. He reminds me a bit of Henry VIII. And I just don't think you can run a modern day democracy like that. And the effects of all of that are coming back to haunt him. And I think that my own view is, why I said what I said in the House last week, my own view is this is going to be extremely bad for my party. And some of you in here may think that's a welcome side effect of this, but I believe that the Conservative Party is at its best when it is an extraordinary coalition of tolerant people. And we are in danger of losing that. And the psephological effect of that is that those people who David Cameron got to support the Tory party in 2015, when for the first time for 23 years, the Conservative Party got a majority, 23 years, all those Liberal seats in the West Country, which came to the Tories, were from internationalist, one nation, liberal types who respected David Cameron's view about internationalism and society, how you run it. And Boris bolted on all these people from the red wall seats who had never voted Conservative before. And, good on him. He made it clear they had only lent us their votes, and levelling up is absolutely critical to retaining their votes and support. But this is a coalition with two quite big ends to it. And I think we are in danger of losing both those ends, which will mean the Conservative Party will not form a government.
Well, rather specific and particular view that you have of the state of the Conservatives. Does anybody have any questions from the audience? I know that's quite a triggering one. I've seen one over here. Just wait for a moment for the microphone. I'm just going to say, just because people are outside the room and won't be able to hear you, if you could, when I point to you, just wait till a microphone arrives. It'll be handed to you. And once you've asked your question, hand it back. It'd be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to reading the book. There's a lot of discussion about the 0.5 getting back to 0.7, but the 0.7 can be a distraction from the content. I wondered if you had any thoughts about what you think the direction of aid spending will go, not just the amount, but the direction, the policy. Do you have much confidence in how it will be handled under the FCDO?
Well, very, very interesting question. I will try and be brief in my answer, because we could talk about this for about an hour or so. I mean, first of all, I think it would be a mistake to go from 0.5 to 0.7 in one financial year. And the reason I say that is not because you can't do it responsibly, because the way you would do it responsibly is you would give a promissory note to some of the the UN agencies, international agencies, so that they would then spend it over more than a year period. So you could do it in a way that would give you value. But I have been trying to persuade the Chancellor that he should look at doing it in 0.6 the year before he's committed, and then 0.7. But the most important reason for this is I don't think the British public will believe it's well spent. You know, assuming it is well spent, they won't believe it because they will say, well, hang on, you're loading £4 billion onto the budget in 1 year. I don't believe you're going to get real value. And part of building up the 50% who are in favor higher is to make it clear that for every hard-earned taxpayer's pound, they're getting 100 pence of delivery on the ground. And so I worry about the capacity to make that case if you do it all in 1 year. But you put your finger on a point I made. I did an urgent question yesterday on Afghanistan. And you know, we have what is happening in Afghanistan is impossible to internalize without tears, because it is so appalling and dreadful. This is not science fiction. People selling their girls for early marriage, for food, selling their organs for food for their family. This is attested by proper journalists and British NGOs that are there. And there's going to be a pledging conference, which the Americans refused to do because they don't want to reawaken what happened in Afghanistan, and which Britain should now host, the pledging conference. And I said in the House yesterday that you know, when I was the development secretary, I spent half my time on the phone, bullying, cajoling, pleading, pressing my counterparts in the rich world to step up to the plate, because what used to happen, the UN have said they need $4.4 billion for Vietnam. This is above everything else, feeding people and hospitals. That's what the money would go for. And traditionally, Britain would do about 10% of that, so long as we got everyone else to step up to the plate and do 90%. Now, Britain's not going to host this conference, and they're certainly not being on the phone around the world cajoling and using people, because all the brilliant officials at DFID who would have done it in the past aren't there anymore, because it's been vaporized and they've gone. And as I warned at the time, these are highly mobile people. You know, they as soon as DFID was destroyed, New York was on the phone, Geneva was on the phone. They knew exactly who to go after from DFID, because DFID was a place into which people came and worked, like Minouche Shafik, who was my first permanent secretary there. She then went to the IMF as the #2, ran it when Strauss-Kahn's career blew up, and then came back, now running the LSE, was a very credible possibility for governor of the Bank of England. You know, she was part of the international system, and Britain had huge authority in all this stuff because everyone knew the depth of expertise and understanding that was there in DFID. All the good people are gone. So Britain hasn't really got the ability now to do what it used to do. And that was the great vision of Blair and Gordon Brown and Cameron, and indeed Theresa May, that this was, you know, Britain was a development superpower in the way that America was a military superpower. And this was our great contribution, Britain, or one of our great contributions, and justification too, for being one of the permanent 5 at the United Nations, which, you know, is an architecture which is going to have to change because it still reflects the post-World War II settlement. But, you know, Britain had real power and ability, not just in money terms at all, but because the great universities, including this one and including this college, contributed to the intellectual power of DFID and helped, and then DFID would help the think tanks develop strategic policy, and the NGOs, British-led, brilliant charities and NGOs around the world, which make such a difference. It's all gone.
We had a question over here in this corner, and then this gentleman here. So.
Hi. So this just links back to something you said earlier about accountability and Parliament. And you mentioned the guillotine clauses, for example. And I wonder what you think about looking at those as symptoms of discourse, which I think both parties have contributed to, but I think especially the Conservative Party in recent years and going back, thinking about, calling judges enemies of the people, undermining rule of law.
Calling who?
Judges. Yes. And
that was the Daily Mail. It wasn't the.
But not denying those. The whole thing about the Attorney General at the time, not the Attorney, sorry, the Minister of Justice. Not calling that out. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, as the party not taking seriously constitutional issues and, focusing on popular issues rather than thinking about, and what effect it's going to have when the Conservatives are out of government and you pass over to another party, like when you're not in control anymore. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, in a sense, you are fleshing out more directly what I was saying earlier, because, if you are running a medieval court rather than using the structures of government, you try to prorogue Parliament, and pull the wool over the Queen's eyes. That's what happens with a medieval court, where instead of, I've got a problem, I've got an issue here, I need to, if I haven't got a good enough cabinet minister dealing with it, I need to fire them and get another one. And I'm going to use the civil service and Whitehall and the sinews of that to govern and to get change. And I mentioned also the National Security Council, and as well as Whitehall and the cabinet. So if, when there's a problem, you say, what are we going to do about this problem? Send for Gove, tell Gove to deal with it. He'll sort it out. And that's it. You get into these messes. And so, that is a problem which we, in my judgment, we are now in the middle of. So to your point about what happens next, of course, if one government gets away with things, then an incoming government will take that ground. And that is part of a much bigger issue, because that is the issue of the legislature as opposed to the executive. The executive in Britain comes out of the legislature. Some ministers in the Lords, but basically it comes out of the House of Commons. And the legislature has to hold to account the executive. And that is why it is so critical that ministers have to tell the truth at the dispatch box. Now, when I was a minister, I was terrified when I was at the dispatch box of getting something wrong. Because if you get something wrong, you are misleading the House, which is without question a resignation issue. And on 2 occasions, I slightly misled the House. And I, with my heart in my mouth, I told the Speaker I needed to go back to the dispatch box and correct it, which I did. Now, trouble is that there is a feeling around that Boris is pretty fast and loose with the truth of the dispatch box. And I mean, to give you an example, yesterday, the government announced that they would take the vaccines that we are sending to the poor world out of the 0.5. But the Treasury have also said that the international value of the vaccines, which is $4, the cost to Britain is $4, the international value is $6, and the Treasury have said that the vaccines will be charged at $6 to the 0.5. Now, on the 6th of June, my colleague Damian Green stood up in the House of Commons and he asked the Prime Minister whether or not he would agree that the vaccines in total should not come out of the 0.5. And the Prime Minister said, yes, that is what we're going to do. Now, this is appalling. You simply cannot do that. You have to hold to account ministers at the dispatch box. And if the legislature gets stopped from doing that, either because it's not taken seriously by civil servants, and it already takes forever to get answers out of departments, answers by letter or by question out of departments, to deal with important constituency cases takes forever. If ministers can get away of not telling the truth at the dispatch box, that is really, really serious. And not for us, for you, for your rights as citizens living in a parliamentary democracy. And in my view, the wheel has gone far too far towards the executive and away from the legislature. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's up to people like me who have no interest in office and who want to be MPs serving their constituents. It's up to people like me to speak out, because if I don't speak out, no one else is going to speak out. And you can't expect, well, it's much more difficult for people who are at the start of their parliamentary careers, who are hoping to get on the ministerial ladder. It's more difficult for them to do it, and it's much easier for me. And I feel a duty to try and do what I can to wrestle back the wheel a bit so that there's more power in Parliament. But the example I've given you from yesterday, I think, is at the heart of the worry that your question expresses.
We had another question over here.
Thank you. This is also a constitutional topic, I think. And when you were speaking about Obama and Guantanamo Bay, you mentioned the checks and balances in the American system and you threw out that we don't have them here. I believe that's right. I put it down a little bit to the emasculation of the Lords, but mainly to the effective party control of votes in the Commons. But that control is at its weakest when Parliament is hung or nearly hung. And in the weeks immediately before the last general election, we saw an example of the House of Commons being much stronger, able to suspend standing orders that worked in the government's favour, able to tell the government to do things in a way that normally the legislature can't. I'm just wondering how you, as a former whip, and obviously therefore with experience of the control of voting, how you look back on that particular period.
What, the period when I was a whip? Or the period at the end of the last Parliament?
The period at the end of the last Parliament,
Yes.
sorry, yes, but
Yes.
drawing on whatever special insights you might have as a former whip.
Well, the truth is that the checks and balances don't exist in Britain. We have a system where the Prime Minister is winner takes all, basically. And therefore, it does depend upon these conventions that we have. And it depends on, you know, people standing by those conventions and sticking by those conventions. And, you know, in my book, I say that our liberties and our human rights and so on are not, in my view, really protected by ministers and judges and the police. They are protected by a free press. Now, I've had my ups and downs with the press. You might not expect me to say that, but also when I want to say something that is hostile to the government, of which I'm a part or member of the party of the government, my view gets out. And when I said in the House of Commons last week from the Prime Minister should go, effectively, I got a text from a journalist in a Central African Republic about an hour later saying, "Are you all right?" So I said, "Yes, why?" And they said, "Because in my country, if you said that about the principal, you'd have trouble getting home that night. You'd be run off the road or whatever." So you know, we live in a country not like that. And why? It's because we have a free press. And you know, a rantankerous, disrespectful, cynical press is the price we pay for having our freedoms. I think that is very important. So there is that check. But on the whole, there isn't. And prime ministers are becoming more and more presidential. And I think that's a very, very bad thing. And I think that we need to stop that. And I think we need to stop that for the legislature, but above all, from your point of view. And there is some quite illiberal legislation coming through. I mean, it's got a very good justification in many ways, but enhancing the powers of the police, particularly over protest, is very tricky. I had spent half an hour talking to a minister about the decisions in the bill to stop noise, so that if noise is intolerable, the police can stop it. And in the end, I decided she got the better of my argument, not least because outside in Parliament Square, the sheer noise and volume of people playing instruments and so on was such I could hardly hear to work. And so I think there is a public nuisance aspect to that, although clearly it's the right of people to protest. I mean, the bill that is coming down the tracks from the Lords is the Nationality and Borders Bill, where in there is the provision for the Home Office to take powers to send asylum seekers off to Central Africa. I mean, it is the most preposterous thing. Can you imagine it? That you arrive here as an asylum seeker, having faced great persecution and fled, and you come to Britain and they say, right, you're off to Central Rwanda now. And remember, 75% of these people get asylum. They get asylum. So what's going to happen to the other 25%? You're going to spend enormous amounts of taxpayers' money shipping them out to Rwanda and then bringing them back when they get asylum. But for those that are left in Central Africa, Rwanda's got enough refugees to deal with from struggles in the countries surrounding them. It's a preposterous idea. They thought they might send them to Ascension Islands. I Googled Ascension Islands from the air to see there's no infrastructure on Ascension Islands apart from a runway. You'd have to build Guantanamo Bay on Ascension Islands in order to do this. And a lot of my colleagues will go along with this because the Home Office will say, well, we're only taking the power. We haven't got a location. But every time they come up with a location, They said it was going to be Albania, and the foreign minister of Albania said it was fake news. And they said they were going to go to Ghana, and the Ghanaian government laughed and said they'd be ridiculous. So there is a sort of illiberalism around which comes from this populism, and we have to be very careful about it. And at the moment we decided not to fight this in the Commons, we wanted it to go to the Lords, and the Lords will put in amendments, which we will, I think a number of us in the Commons will support, because it's more difficult for the government to take something out of a bill than for us to put something into a bill. So we'll see what happens. But these are quite illiberal measures, taking someone's nationality away, because the Home Secretary thinks they should have it taken away. But you can do it without telling them. There's a provision which you don't have to tell them, you just take it away. This comes out of northeast Syria particularly, but you can't do these sort of things. It's not right.
As an Australian, I'm going to skirt right past the finding in Ireland to put asylum seekers and move on to not express my political views. But we did have some questions from online before we move to the rest of the people in the audience here. One of which you've already covered for Bill, who was online, who said he was shocked when Rees-Mogg said the system was now presidential. He fears that this started with Tony Blair. What did you think? I think you've covered that one in part, but we also, did you want to comment a bit
just
more?
to add one thing, which is what Jacob was doing, was he was trying to say you can't change a leader without having an election. That's the point he was making, because he hoped that this would persuade my colleagues who we don't want an election because we might lose our seat. Therefore, we should stick with Boris Johnson. That was why he said it. He wasn't making the point that I was making, which is that it shouldn't be presidential. He was saying that it was. But actually, Jacob from the backbenchers would not agree with that. I mean, Jacob is saying that because he's a good and loyal member of Boris's cabinet.
We had another question online that I just want to cover before we go to the rest in the room. Given the position of the UK, why is it not delivering the COVID-19 vaccine to the very poorest countries in need? The UK has a moral obligation to help those in need rather than over-vaccination records, which seem to be what's happening. It's opting for its population.
Well, it's my first duty is to make sure my constituents have access to vaccines to protect them from COVID. And there's no question that our own constituents come first. But if you are evaluating what is in the national interest, it is not in the national interest that no vaccines are getting to Africa, because the effect of that will be that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And unless we share these vaccines and put money into making sure they get to the poorest people in the world, where there aren't the structures to either make them or deliver them, unless we help with that, we will suffer. So it's in our own interest to make sure these vaccines reach the parts of the world where they've been very slow to reach. And other countries are doing so too. Rwanda, for example, to return to a country we've mentioned a few times tonight, has had a lot of help from the Germans. I mean, they usually would expect to have it from us because we have a very close relationship, or did have a very close relationship with Rwanda. But Britain, because of our international development prowess in the past, should have been leading all of this. There's going to be a Biden summit on vaccines, but we need at that point the whole international community to step up to the plate and recognize that it's in everyone's interest that these vaccines should reach poor people.
We had a question up here, the lady in the red row.
Hi, Andrew. Very much enjoyed and totally agree with what you're saying about DFID. But actually, I do have a question, which we haven't really talked about, which is about trust. What do you think about all the issues that have come up in relation to MPs and trust, which have been, filling the papers on almost a daily basis since the Owen Paterson incident? The people sense that are MPs in Parliament to represent their constituents, or are they there to serve their own business interests? There does seem to be a sense that rules and regulations, there's a concern that rules and regulations don't seem to matter. What do you think about that? Do you think that things have changed, that people have a different perspective about their jobs in Parliament or not? And this is not a personal criticism, I'm generally interested in this.
Well, I don't think there have been lots of stories in the press recently about individual MPs, or at least I'm not conscious of that. But let's be clear, the expenses crisis, which I would argue was extremely badly handled by the two party leaders, but the expenses crisis drove a horse and cart through people's views about members of parliament. And let's also be clear that if you look at the Gilray cartoons from the 18th and 19th century, members of parliament have never been held in high esteem, particularly high esteem. And in this country, we tend to respect and hold the highest regard for the dignified part of the Constitution, as Bagehot called it, and we tend to hold those with real power. It's quite important that they shouldn't be over-respected, and they should be held to account, and that's what the media does. But the thing ratcheted down over expenses. Oh, right. Well, that's and I'm one of those that do. And the answer is, in my judgment, so long as they put their constituents first and they don't have conflicts of interest, then there is no reason why they shouldn't do so. I, for example, spend about half a day a week on outside interests. I advise a Central African, a Pan-African advisory house, and I advise a private equity firm. From my experiences before I was in the House of Commons as a director of Lazard, and so long as it doesn't take up too much of my time, my constituents get the other 6.5 days a week, and there's half a day for that. Now, that is the rules. That's what the rules say. The rules say that you can have outside interests like that. And being a member of parliament is not, a job. It's a way of life more than a job. It's a sort of, I would argue it's a vocation. And so long as your constituents always come first and that the interests are open and are declared and are within the rules, I don't see any problem with that. And indeed, I would go further than that. I would say that if you ban all outside interests, you will get a very different type of House of Commons. Now, you may think that's a good thing, but that people are supposed to bring into the House of Commons knowledge and expertise and understanding in their particular area. They're not supposed to use it like a sort of college of further education. And you want members of parliament who do that, and you won't get them if you say no outside interests. And also, you won't be able to enforce it, because are you saying that a journalist cannot write, for the newspapers or write books as an outside interest? Are you saying that lawyers can't maintain their practice, doctors can't maintain their practice? It would be almost impossible to enforce, but you'd end up with a bromided commons, which is not in your interests, I submit, as constituents.
On the point of rules, before we go up to the balcony, we've got a question from outside the room on what are your thoughts on the rule that you can't call someone a liar in Parliament? If you continue upholding your side of the gentleman's agreement when another is quite obviously doing so, are you still being a gentleman or becoming an enabler?
Well, this is something that the Speaker is quite exercised about. But I think it's rather undignified to talk about people lying. You're a liar. And it's all tied up with the fact that we always speak through the Speaker. So if I am contesting something you've said, I will say, the Honourable Lady says such and such, but actually so-and-so, because I'm speaking to the Speaker about you. Once you start engaging directly, and this has been true for hundreds of years, I think the whole thing becomes much more difficult to keep in an orderly way. And so the rules of order at the House of Commons are you don't do that. But equally, if someone is misleading the House, they have to be called out. And that's the point that the Speaker has been worrying about. And indeed, when someone said that, I never call Boris a liar. I say he changed his mind or something like that, because it seems to me to be an injection of the over-personal. And I can make the point in another way. So I think those rules, which are referred to, are quite important. But to the questioner, he's in the same place as the Speaker. The Speaker is worried about not just the quality of our discourse, but also how you address these issues.
Right, we had a question up on the balcony.
I share your disgust really at the lowering of international aid from 0.7% to 0.5%. I read recently about a survey in the US, but the same holds true of many richer countries. When asked, do you think the government spends too much of its budget on international aid? The majority of people say yes. And then when asked immediately after that, what percentage they think the government should give, they say 10%. How do you think this difference in opinions has come about, and how do you think it should be reconciled?
You're absolutely right. And if you ask them what they think the government sends, they say, I think they say 3 to 5%, I think. So all those figures are absolutely correct. What the poll shows, quite interesting, the polling on development shows, we carried out some polling in 2012. So 2 years into the Tory government, we'd had the period of very great austerity, big cuts in public funding under George Osborne. And we went out rather nervously and we polled what people thought about development. And we had done the same thing just before we came into office, or it had been done. And it was very interesting, the result. The result was that support overall had gone up from 46% to 50%. Even in the time of austerity, it was just shy of 50%, 49.9%. But the figure of support was much higher amongst women than men, and vastly higher amongst those under the age of 30. So you can make the case, and I like to think that the reason why it went up quite significantly in those 2 years was because you had a development secretary and a prime minister who were passionate about it and who made the case. And when the Daily Mail wrote rubbish about development, I would insist on a right of reply. It made me very unpopular with them, but instead of what DFID used to do, because it knew it had cover from Number 10, was to lie low when these ridiculous stories were printed. But we contested them. So those 2 years, very difficult years, support went up. And so the message is you've got to stand up for what you believe. You've got to fight for it. You've got to explain why it's in the national interest. It's not a bunch of rich people plundering the public purse for their charitable objectives. It's about a strategic national interest, as well as being the right thing to do. And if you don't have that background, which is what we don't have at the moment, there's no one defending it. And if the Prime Minister says, as he did, that DFID was a great big cash cow in the sky spewing out money, which is what he said from the dispatch box, I nearly had a fit that a Prime Minister could make a statement like that. So irresponsible. Of course, you'll expect people to say that they don't think money should be spent if the Prime Minister's saying it's spent in that way. So it's about people like me being far clearer and far more convincing on the argument. And it's one of, as I say, it's one of my great failures in life that I've failed to do. I did move the dial a bit, but I failed what I believe is an unanswerable case, failed to get it across. And of course, in a pandemic when some people are very, very worried about their income or their local school and are very concerned about this, spending money overseas is contentious. But my answer to that is you have to make the case.
We had a question over here from the Bursar.
Andrew, it's great to see you back here. You've quite often reflected on your early period in politics in the 1990s, where there's a lot of tensions in government, and that's clearly happening now. But if I look back over, I'd say, the last 15 years, the one thing that has come out in the legislature is the lack of a credible opposition. And that has been a constant theme for quite a while now. And I was wondering what effect you thought that was having and how much of a problem it is for democracy.
Well, you're absolutely right in what you say, but it is a sort of theory of politics that the opposition should always be, better than they are. And governments get away with it when the opposition is weak. So, for example, if you look back, when Ian Duncan Smith was leader of the opposition, Tony Blair knew that he was an advantage for Labour. The Tory party had gone walkabout. And Tony Blair used to pull his punches at Prime Minister's questions because he could see all of us sitting with our head in our hands behind Ian as Tony Blair demolished him. And so he started to pull his punches and he wouldn't go in so hard against Ian. The mirror thing is true of Corbyn. Corbyn, like him though I do, was probably never electable as a Prime Minister. And there's a sort of feeling, in a sense, that he was almost leading a cult within the Labour Party. And then go back to 1983 when Michael Foot was leader, and the Labour manifesto in 1983 was described by Gerald Kaufman as the longest suicide note in history. Parties go walkabout. And one of the reasons why I'm speaking out now quite contentiously is because I don't want the Tory party to go walkabout again. I want them to put it right now and regenerate while it's in government so that it fulfills what the public want to see it do and gets re-elected. So I think that is the natural course of things. And equally, we live in a country which is a cricket playing country. So we believe in the other side having a go. And the strongest clarion call at any election is always time for change. So I think, in what you are describing in a way, the unnatural rhythm, but nevertheless the real rhythm of politics, is that when parties get kicked out of office, they tend to look in on themselves and they sometimes form a sort of circular firing squad. But that's the nature of the beast.
We have very little time remaining and we have a few questions in the room and outside. I'm just going to capture a few from outside and then we'll go to, I believe you had a question there. There was two more there, one from somebody, and is there any over here? No. Okay, so I will go outside the room. 1, 2, 3. You're going to be busy. Sorry. From outside the room, we have Dr. Ricky Lee, who is a senior research associate of the Intellectual Forum, who has asked, given your experience in Cyprus, what do you think are the prospects of a resolution of the dispute there? And what role may the UK have in moving towards one as one of the treaty guarantors?
What a very interesting question. I mean, the Cyprus is this most beautiful place. Some of you may perhaps know it. Island divided in 1974 following the Turkish invasion. And I was a peacekeeping soldier with the United Nations there in the 1st Royal Tank Regiment in 1975. And we moved the Turks from the Greek south to the north, thus establishing the de facto partition of the island. And it's still not sorted now. And indeed, all the people we moved, most of them were very happy being in the Greek south, but they had to move because Ankara and Turkey told them they had to move. So I witnessed them, in tears hugging their Greek neighbors as we took them all off to the north. So the divide was quite an artificial one, and everyone agrees that they should be reunited. There's no longer the angst between Turkey and Greece, or at least not to the extent there was in the mid-70s. It very, very nearly happened in a referendum some years ago, but unfortunately, in the end, it didn't. And it's one of those very frustrating circumstances where it will eventually happen, and we should do everything we can to ensure that it happens quickly. Now, as you rightly say, Britain was a guarantor. And in the book, I tell the story about more by sleight of hand than anything else, how the Turks were stopped from taking over the whole island. But in terms of the ability of the Foreign Office now to focus on that, it would be quite a big ask, given everything else that's going on. And whether or not we would have the ability to bring the parties together, I suspect it's better done by the United Nations.
Okay, we had a question here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you would, I'd like you to develop one of your answers a little bit further about the regeneration of the Conservative Party, and to give a sense as to where you think that sort of regeneration, where that might go. What is a likely trajectory, not a sort of a Panglossian what we would love to see, but what is a potential likely trajectory? And maybe the link there to the international development discussions, that CIFID was very good. The Conservative Friend of International Development was very broad within the party, and it was a very progressive and a very positive force there. Whereas the movements now, the various research groups, are very destructive and quite reactionary. But that appears to be where the ideas are. Do you think that there is space for a healthy trajectory to develop?
Well, it's the $60 million question. I mean, there's going to be a leadership issue, going to be a leadership election, in my judgment, soon. I can't tell you when, but it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And there will then be a vote in Parliament, and then more importantly, there'll be a vote in the country, and there'll be 2 candidates, and one will be the right-wing candidate. So the difficulty is that the centre-left of the party tend to be herbivores, and the right tend to be meat-eaters, I would argue, if you see what I mean? And I think that the party has got to think very carefully about what its offer is to the British people. We're not a debating society. We're about practical politics. And so we have to wrestle with being the party of low tax at a time of a very big state, and quite right to have a very big state, because there's no doubt that the government earned a lot of credit for putting its arms around families and businesses, which would have been destroyed by the pandemic. And even in the hospitality sector, for example, where people have been hanging on by their fingertips, they've just about managed to hang on. So these are big questions. And in my view, the Conservative Party is always at its best when it embraces the one nation tradition. And the one nation tradition, you can see it in a lot of the things that Churchill said about people being able to grow as tall as they can, but a safety net below which no one must be allowed to fall. It's about the internationalism of the party, not being a narrow, a nationalist, being international, reaching out. Those are the issues which people have to address ideologically at a time when most people don't vote for, I mean, some of them do, but a lot of people don't vote for a leader on grounds of policy. They vote for the leader because they like them, or they've worked with them, or relationships are much more important than ideology, in my experience. And I've been involved in quite a lot of leadership campaigns.
So who's going to be the next Prime Minister?
I have no idea, but there will be an ideological divide. And then we'll see how people handle that.
We had a question here.
In your opinion, what do you think poses the greatest threat to Britain's long-term international reputation? Is it one, the decline of the armed forces, or is it secondly the decline of or diminishing influence of the international aid sector?
Very, very interesting question. Do you want to take the chap at the back as well?
Yes. This will be our last question from in the room, and I might add one to that from outside the room that dovetails nicely. So the gentleman at the back.
Andrew, given the levels of abuse on social media and in the popular press that MPs now get, and indeed threats and in some tragic cases, actual acts of violence, do you think Parliament will be able to attract future candidates of satisfactory calibre?
And we had one more thing before we move to that.
Let me, because I'm a bear of little brain, let me try and deal with those two questions. That question is quite close to your friend on your right's question as well. I mean, I think they are interlinked, those two questions. I mean, I'm probably at the thicker skinned end of Parliament. I mean, I won't have any protection in the constituency. I certainly won't allow the police into my surgeries. And I have learnt, having been an international cabinet minister, that protection comes not from guns and things. It comes from anonymity or people not knowing what you're doing. That's where protection comes. So I'm not changing my life because of this end of the spectrum, but there are others who are not in that place, and in particular women in Parliament who put up with the most extraordinary levels of abuse. Now, I am not on Twitter, mainly because my children told me they would divorce me as their father if I went on Twitter. And I am considering having an office Twitter account, but I'm not on Twitter, so I don't see this abuse. But there are some of my colleagues who read what goes on and are horrified by it. And I say to my councillors who get 4 rude comments on Twitter and go into decline that they just shouldn't read it. But I accept that argument is not a sufficient answer to part of your question. We've got to find a way of ensuring that the openness of British parliamentary activity continues. And therefore, we must stamp down on some of this stuff. And we just have to get the balance right. The harms bill will be a chance to really ventilate these arguments. I think we need to impose far more responsibility on these big tech companies for stopping it. I don't think it's good enough for them to take a sort of vanilla approach and only stop the most egregious parts of it. I think there needs to be a code which they make a lot of money, they need to enforce it. So I think that is part of the answer. But in the end, you really don't want a barrier between members of Parliament and their constituents, or the whole thing will then go into very sharp decline. On your point about which, I mean, forgive me for saying, but there is no doubt in my mind, having, had a close relationship with, having served as a soldier and being the development secretary, there is no doubt whatsoever that Britain's influence in the world comes from our soft power. And it's not just international development. Britain stands at various crossroads. We are a leading figure in the North-South organization of the Commonwealth. In or out of the EU, we are a major European power. We are the second biggest figure in NATO, yes, but we have the English language. London is the place where you go, I mean, at its best. I think the respect for the British judicial and criminal justice system is massively overblown. I think that it is unbelievably creaky, very expensive, unbelievably slow, and rather pompous and self-satisfied. But if you want to settle a commercial dispute, London is the place to come and do it. So we have all these advantages in Britain, which are soft power advantages, but we also have the ability through NATO to move the dial on issues which affect our national security. So my answer to your question is that in a way that the armed forces are almost a subset of the other part that you were asking about, which international development is a major but not the only part.
A final question from Peter Williamson, who is out of the room, who's one of the fellows here in the college.
He's in Scotland, I think.
He has asked, how do you see the relationship between the UK and the Biden administration and the US going forward?
What a very interesting question. I mean, first of all, I am a complete skeptic about the special relationship. I think there is really no such thing. I mean, we have a community of interest with America on a whole series of issues, not totally, but a whole series of issues where we agree and we work together. But I think the idea that there is a special relationship in anything other than the intelligence world, really, and a bit in the military world, but in the intelligence world, is illusory. But they are our closest ally, and we are probably still their closest ally. Although I think the Americans think more about the EU and Europe first rather than us, but that's a sort of changing thing. And also depends to a large extent upon events which need to be addressed. I think that it's much easier with Biden than it was with Trump. Hillary Clinton, whom I know a bit, was in London and thinks that Trump will run again, and maybe he could win. I think if Trump does win again, it really says something incredibly serious about democracy. And I haven't quite got my head around what that means. But so under Biden, much better. I long for the days of the closeness that existed between Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and between Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. I think that was in the interest of both countries to have that sort of leadership and closeness. I don't think we're ever going to get it with Biden.
Well, on that point, thank you for your many anecdotes, both on the past and on the future. We've really appreciated and found this really interesting. For those of you who haven't already read it, myself included, I have to say, the book, I'm sure, will cover many things, and I've been told it is very amusing as well as informative. So thank you for spending the time writing it, and thank you for taking the time to answer our questions. I know you'll be around a little bit after to mingle with those who are here, but thank you also to those who've joined us online for your many questions as well. But thank you for joining us tonight, Andrew, and for all of your insights.
Yeah.